Hello and welcome to the Capital Press Club Legacy podcast series. I'm your host, Colin Campbell, and this is our first podcast of the year. I'd like to welcome our first guest, Jonathan Franklin. He's a multi platform reporter for National Public Radio, otherwise known as NPR. Welcome, Jonathan. Thanks for joining us for this podcast and being our inaugural guest for 2023.
Thanks for having me.
Jonathan, you have been pretty much starting your journey out several years ago. Tell us what you did along your journey that got you into NPR and started you on a new trajectory.
Yeah, so I have sort of like a true, I want to say more of like an unconventional journey into public media. So I used to be in television. I started off as a television producer, doing digital content producing, and also doing line producing for several television stations in the DC area. Eventually transitioned into reporting full time. I'm doing digital reporting and doing on camera reporting. So going in from the television space into public radio was sort of a bit of not like a culture shock, but it has this pretty much like its similarities and its differences. So coming from the television world, also was a freelancer for a few digital media sites and for a few newspapers. So having a bit of a background within like print, digital, magazine, television, and then transitioning into radio. So it's sort of I hit all of the boxes within journalism, doing pretty much like everything, and then coming full circle to NPR. So it sort of didn't really plan on going into radio. I thought I was going to have a longer television career or a longer trajectory in television, but I wanted to try something different. I wanted to try something new that kind of like pushed my boundaries and sort of was pushing the envelope and not getting more so complacent, but sort of wanted to try the realm of radio and see how you can tell stories within using the power of audio and as well as podcasting to be able to still bring those stories to life.
Yeah, you are part of a tradition that is sort of contemporary, and that is being able to do it all, right? You are a multi platform reporter, meaning you are going to be responsible for doing print. Of course, that is now mostly online. You're going to be responsible for doing radio and then maybe doing some video, obviously, because it'll be online. You have to be capable of answering all of those calls. What do you find challenging about doing things that are cross platform? But something that's becoming more of the norm for journalists today.
I would say something that, a challenge that I have that's sort of like a strength, but it's also a challenge is the writing style. So, like, writing for audio is completely different from writing from, for digital. Writing for digital is completely different from writing from, for print in some cases. Writing for print is different than writing for, television or video. So, being able to use those different writing styles to tell stories is pretty powerful, but oftentimes you can't really use some of the same things that you would say in print, reading for the looking for the reading for the eye versus reading for the ear. So you are like losing some skills in a sense, and you're not really writing around video, but you're able to kind of sort of still have sort of those similarities and differences, but sort of the writing styles, like you would have to master and be able to write in multiple ways for multiple platforms.
One of the things that has become a sensation over the past few years, especially with online audience, is audio sensory meridian response. We know it more commonly as ASMR. And this is a technique, a sound technique, a very rich sound technique and audio technique that I would think is especially compatible with radio. What has been your experience in experimenting with that a bit? Because although in TV we did have it, it was part of creating sound on tape and narrative sound or diegetic noise, as they may say in film. It's taken on almost like if you could imagine, like a 3D or 4D type of dynamic when it comes to radio and, of course, upgraded sound quality.
Yeah, more so with radio nowadays, you have to use more of like authentic, natural sound. And by meaning by that is, you have to make sure that a lot of what you're gathering for, I was going to say SOTS, but SOTS is the television the television version.
Right.
But you making sure that your pops or your nats are being able to be like authentic. So if you're having conducting an interview and there's, natural sound like in the background, like you want to make sure you get that. If you're, walking with your subject or walking with your interview and you see, there's, construction going on, or there's like, if it's on a busy street, you want to make sure to get that. In comparison to, using a lot of what, archival sound or other elements of audio, but being able to use that real, like, authentic sound. I feel like that's what the industry now is going toward, is more like authenticity within a lot of the audio pieces and incorporating that, and not just having like random audio bits just like thrown in the story and in the piece. Because, oftentimes shows, they give you a time crunch. It's like, okay, you have 3 minutes and 45 seconds to tell this story. And it's like, oh, I have, all of this tape. I have, 35 minutes worth of tape, and I have to condense it to, 3 minutes to make the slot. So you have to really be cognizant of your audio and cognizant of your time, and even with your writing, to make sure that it all really comes to full picture, or in this case, full audio, to be able to encompass the story.
Yeah. Do you have a particular beat that you are responsible for, or is it pretty wide encompassing?
Um, when I first started on at NPR, it was pretty much general assignments. I was doing a lot of, the breaking news. I was doing a lot of the, covering this trial, or, filling in for politics, or doing, news of the day. But nowadays, I focus more of my stories on, and my beat is now race and identity. So race and identity, obviously, it's like a larger umbrella. It's like, oh, well, Jonathan, what can you report on the race and identity? But a lot of what I do, is finding the intersection with the race and identity within like politics, within current events, within breaking news, within education. So finding those intersections and being able to tell those stories and incorporating race and identity into them. Because, I have friends that are in the industry, and friends that are, journalists, that say, well, how can you combine race to, you know, these everyday subjects? And I'm like, well, it's really possible to do it. I mean, when you look around at, race is really everywhere. You can really just pull, put all the subjects and things in a hat and then pull something out. And I can pretty much, find a common denominator or find an intersection within race within those beats. So it's being able to find and tell those stories and incorporate a race angle, or just, coming out with, sources giving me information saying, hey, I think you would be interested in this. It's, within the race angle, within the race beat, and being able to find and, make sure to tell the stories within, NPR, for NPR's audiences, and being able to kind of weave it into, previous reporting that I've done, or previous reporting that my colleagues have done, to ensure that, we're not just talking about this to talk about this, but make sure that it falls within some sort of like perimeter of like our reporting guidelines.
Yeah, so could you take us through a day in Jonathan Franklin's life as a reporter for NPR? How does it start out and how does it end?
Wow, that's a good question. I feel like every day is not really the same. There's
Yeah.
some days where I'm like scouring for, you know, finding, story pitches for the editorial meeting, and I'm like, all right, let me find three story ideas and make sure, let me clean out my inbox and dig through them half the day. Some days it's, going, logging on and, going for the editorial meeting, and there's breaking news that's happened within my feed. So I immediately have to like jump on, with on the story. Or half the day, so, it's, I'm logging on and it's continuing coverage from something that I've done either the day before, or week before, or a previous trial. So it's pretty much, not, I would say it's not the same. I feel like every day I log on and there's something new. Given a national platform versus local news, it's always something new. You turn on the television and it's like, oh, good morning. There's, this is happening in the world. But pretty much and thankfully at NPR, we have, they allow us to do both, day turns, but also enterprise pieces, and also, longer form stories. So I'm being able to flex those muscles within, oh, I can do this day turn for digital and for, one of the magazine shows. But, I'm doing that alongside doing another piece that's going to air later this week, while also focusing on another piece that may air later this month. So it's being able to juggle multiple stories at the same time, but still having that case to, not just focus on like one medium and just focusing on digital, but also like writing for radio, writing for, podcasts, and collaborating with multiple teams, multiple desks, and still having that chance to still be like multi-platform and cross-platform across all NPR's
Yeah, I wanted to jump to you in a second when you talked about when you wake up and there's news there and you find out, okay, my day may shape up a little bit differently than I had anticipated. But first, before I ask you about that, what kind of equipment are you using? Because with technology and communications at that intersection, it seems that almost every other year there's new equipment. There are new ways to do something that may have been traditional, but of course, with the internet things have changed it up a bit. So, being that you have to appeal to different senses, different platforms, what are you using these days?
Well, alongside my computer and my two smartphone devices, we have a work phone and a personal phone. We have reporter kits. So we have a sort of like an MMJ style kit for not obviously lugging around the camera, but having like audio equipment. So I have, 4 or 5 different recorders. I have a stick mic. So if I'm able to, if I'm by myself recording interview, I have the long stick mic that I can, use it for, gathering audio that's, far out. I have actually another, like a regular stick mic, that's like a shorter one that, you have for television. I have one of those. I have the lav mic. I have several different other little smaller Tascam recorders. So I have about like I want to say like 5 or 6 microphones and 6 or 7 different recorders and a whole bunch of cables. So if I need to, travel to a story, whether it's breaking news, I'll just literally lug all of that equipment with me because I don't know what I'm going to use. If I have to be out in the field for long periods of time, I, will have to assess and say, okay, I need to, use this microphone, plug this up to this recorder, and put the microphone with all the other microphones if it's like a breaking news press conference. So being able to just kind of assess the scene and assess, what I would need, I just literally just lug all of my equipment. If I'm working from home, I usually just use Zoom. And being able to record the audio from Zoom and then have the other person, we have this like fancy app called Report It, and being able to get the audio from their end and they send it back to me. So I have both audio, both like from, Report It and both from Zoom. So being able to use like between my computer, my phones, and all my slew of recording kits and microphones, and being able to pretty much gather all audio at all costs.
Basically, you're a mobile studio. I mean, you have so much equipment, you're pretty much a studio, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. So have you ever used that telescopic microphone for gaggles, for example?
I have. So I've used that when I've covered a lot of gaggles with like, elected officials. So for instance, when I was in Buffalo, we were able to use, you use that long, microphone for gaggles, especially if you're trying to, chase politicians or chase elected officials and you're, don't have the ability like in television, you have like a producer or a photojournalist that, be able to help you out is pretty much, myself. And if I'm, with another person that's another audio producer, we're pretty much, running to get the story at the same time. So being able to have the long stick mic for gaggles is really helpful because you can just really just extend it down and just get your audio that way and still have, have your headphones in and listen and to make sure the audio is great. But being able to use that version of microphone is very helpful because you just never know in a situation, especially here in DC, you just never know in a situation when you're going to need to gather so much audio and feed it back in for in-house for whatever show, whatever studio, whatever platform. Yeah, I'd rather just get a lot more audio than to have a lot less.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I was assuming that you were in Buffalo to cover the trial of the man who gunned down several black people in that city. If I'm wrong, correct me, but tell me what that experience was like if you were there for that particular story.
So I wasn't there for that particular story. I was in Buffalo after the shooting took place, so was
Mhm.
able to kind of assess the situation, saying, okay, what stories can we tell and still have some sort of decency, 10 people just died, 3 people were injured, and still wanting to, get the news out, but not do it in a way where it's too like inhumane. So it was able to find a lot of like human interest stories while still telling like the news of the day of like what's going on. Is the supermarket still closed? What are people doing to gather, the essentials like fresh food, fresh fruits, fruits and veggies, etc., and is what was temporarily a food desert. So being able to kind of gather those stories and gather those elements and still be able to tell the stories and still inform viewers and listeners of what exactly happened, was able to kind of do that. And then, once, things started slowing down, still was able to tell those stories from here in DC, but being able to, come up with not creative ways in a sense, but still telling those stories in a sense where, okay, there's this new initiative from the Department of Justice that's going to, combat hate crimes. And, some people are skeptical about it. Some people are, in favor of it. So still being able to tell those type of stories, like the legal proceedings, and also still keep up with the trials and the, keeping up with the families and still keeping up with elected officials about what they're doing to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. Not only just in New York and not just in Buffalo, but it's across the United States. So still being able to kind of weave those stories and tell those stories from what happened May 14th, and then use it for like previous coverages. Of course, we're still reporting on incidences of mass shootings, and it all kind of relates back to what I covered in Buffalo, like Highland Park, Monterey Park, Uvalde. So being able to still tell those stories and kind of relate them back in some way, shape, or form, and still, keep in touch with, keep a log of what exactly is happening, what exactly has happened within the last year.
When you're looking at various stories and you're looking at the best angles, have you ever been tempted or encouraged to cover a funeral? I know that there are some news shops that discourage that kind of activity. I know I used to work for one that every time somebody was killed, they'd send me a pack in with a camera guy and they would tell me to cover the funeral, which I was often loath to do just because of like what you just talked about, were sensitivities to the situation. Do you think that you would ever have to cover a funeral? Have you covered a funeral while being at NPR?
I haven't covered her funeral while at NPR. Don't want to say thankfully because I'm pretty sure like it will eventually happen at some way down the line. When
Yeah.
working in local news, I've covered several funerals with gun violence, with drinking and driving. I remember one specific instance. I was filling in on the weekend shift, and I walked in and, they were saying, hey, you need to immediately go to the scene. There were 5 kids that were killed. And I was like, oh gosh, like what happened? And then eventually we learned that the situation, it was, involving drinking and driving. So was able to kind of, tell that initial story of what happened and then keep up with, the family and the family funeral. So being able to tell the stories in a way that, of course, still was humane, but also still kind of had that hard news angle at the end of the day, saying like, oh, these 5 kids died after, this incident with drinking and driving. All the kids, were unfortunately ejected from the car. So being able to still, have the story of the funeral and still had a human interest angle to it, but still also had the hard news behind it, that kind of saying like, oh, we're not just telling this story of this funeral of these 5 kids, but this is why we're telling it.
Right. Now, you have covered race and identity, race and culture, something that is definitely important to me as well. My doctorate is in that as well. I woke up to the news of Scott Adams, the Dilbert illustrator, who's being dropped by several newspapers across the country for comments that have been controversial at the very least. Some may say negatively provocative. What is your take on Scott Adams, some of the comments he made about not trying to live around black people and that he identified as black for a while? This is a white gentleman who said he identified as black for a while. What do you take or what do you make of these types of instances that seem to pop up every few months where there seems to be discussions of racism and separation and segregation, all while claiming a sense of victimization?
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, nowadays, we see a lot of instances of racism, whether it's online, whether it's a resurface of something that happened a few years ago, or whether it's with for instance, January 6th. So we see a lot of these instances nowadays. And as journalists, we have to, of course, tell the story and, of course, do our job to tell both sides of the situation, both sides of the story. I do think that, now as race and identity reporters and under this beat, it's tasked a lot harder for us to tell a lot of race stories because of for instance, some newsrooms may not have the support of having a full-fledged like race identity beat or race identity team, or you have to go to bat to say like, oh, like why these stories are important and like why we're telling these stories. But in the specific instance, given everything that's happened since George Floyd's death, it's becoming more mainstream. And we don't know if that's because of the power journalism that holding people accountable, it's becoming mainstream, or if people are becoming you know I guess comfortable with saying a lot of these things and they don't think they're going to be held accountable. But given a lot of like the power of journalism, the power of storytelling, it has become more mainstream because we are, as journalists, holding people accountable. And as our job, we just have to tell the story and tell it both sides and saying this happened from start to finish. And whether it's warranted to having follow up stories after that, doing our best to stay on top of the situation, on top of the stories, and being able to inform viewers and inform listeners of race is still a thing, regardless of the racial awakening and things that happened in 2020. It's still prevalent and it still will continue to be prevalent in all aspects of life.
In the social media age, we look at how journalism has evolved, and we've always talked about something that you just mentioned: giving people the opportunity to speak, to present their side. And but it seems that within this social media age, this digital age, it seems to become more lopsided, especially in a 24-hour news cycle when you have specific networks devoted to maybe one point of view or one specific bias. Do you ever feel that when you are trying to give both sides, that one side may not actually be a legitimate perspective or a legitimate side? And let me give you an example. Like when the reports came out about COVID, for example, and there are all these theories about how to rid oneself of COVID using various methods. There was that fear that presenting that side, even though it was an other side to taking the vaccine, would then encourage behaviors that were not productive or that might actually be detrimental to individuals or a community, neighborhood, or society. You ever feel that there's a jeopardization of what you're reporting because of maybe presenting a side that may not be totally legitimate or productive?
No, I do think that like everybody has a story. That's one of my mottos. Like everybody has a story, whether it you know may be good or may be bad. I feel like everybody has a story and has a story to tell. I do think in the instance when touching on sensitive subjects or touching on relevant current events such as like COVID or such as an election or such as any form of politics or even the race identity umbrella, we have to be as journalists cognizant of telling both sides and having more of like fair and balance within stories, because you don't, like you said earlier, you don't want to skew to one particular way, left or right, when telling those stories, because you don't want to project a fear or a view that you're being on one side of the subject and not the other. So as a journalist, we have to whether if it's something that it's morally incorrect, or if it's something that is under the beat of racism or discrimination or prejudice, you have to have fair and balance. And I feel like nowadays going into specific instances, like for instance, going into this next, election cycle, we have to be as journalists, hold ourselves accountable, but also like still tell both sides of the situation and still be fair and balanced when we're giving our reporting. Because as our job as journalists, we have to, like I said, be fair and objective, but still get the news out to viewers in a way that doesn't have a lot of like disinformation, misinformation to lead viewers the incorrect information. So as moving forward within, this year of 2023, in the age of digital media, social media, TikTok, everything, we have to be more, like I said, be more cognizant in getting the accurate information, getting the facts, and portraying that out, so that way we're not leaving viewers with misinformed information or misinformed views on whatever subject that is talked about.
When you're reporting, there are so many different angles, right? And you are probably inundated with so much information, especially because you have many outlets reporting the same news. You might be able to speak to different sources. What is the most challenging part about your job, you think, at this point?
I think at this point, because starting off in my career in local news, you're able to, still tell the story, but find different ways of telling that story. So for me, I'm always keen about, being more of a storyteller and not a quote, reporter. Yes, like my title is reporter, but in that instance, like it's different being a reporter versus a storyteller. And what I mean by that is like being a reporter, you can just go off like the press release version of what happened and just give the bullet points and, saying, oh, at 6 o'clock this morning, 4 people were shot, 3 people died, and kind of go about it that way and kind of not saying more of like, being a robot, but in a sense of you're doing the reporting, but storytelling is like pushing that envelope and finding characters and finding people that are impacted by this one decision and telling the story of what's happening. So I feel like on a national level, it's a bit difficult because, you don't just focus on DC, you just don't focus on what's in the Beltway. You have all of the United States to find characters. And so being able to find a character that is impacted by whatever decision, whatever bill that's passed, whatever that, is going on in the world, finding that character and finding the humanity angle in a sense and telling their story and looping it back to whatever is going on, I feel like relates more to people in a sense than just kind of doing whatever 5, 10, 25 different outlets are doing, because you can easily type in whatever subject matter in Google and read 25 of the same articles. But finding your article that tells a story of that issue, but has more of a humanity angle, I feel like would get people to understand the issues that we're talking about.
Okay. And what is that big story for you that you would like to do right now? I know it could change in a month or maybe next year, but for right now, for Jonathan Franklin, what's the big story that you would love to be on if you're not already on it?
Oh, that is a good question. I feel like a big story. I mean, we're going into this next election cycle, and I kind of touched on this when I reported something on something like this similar within midterm elections, but going into the larger, 2024 presidential election, I'm talking more about how Black voters are turning out more to the polls in comparison to previous years, and whether that's because of like the power of social media, whether that's we've seen with like in comparison to different presidencies and different administrations, what we're seeing now, or like different issues that have come within the last 3-4 years, such as like COVID, such as the racial awakening we've had across the United States, seeing how the impact of Black and Brown voters have had, since 2022 midterms, but looking into 2024, how they're having an impact on the polls, and whether that may be, a huge impact on, elections, or not like a smaller impact, or there's not an impact at all. So looking more into that and seeing what the trends are, what more Black men are concerned about in comparison to Black women, in comparison to you know Latino women, Latino men. So looking at more of the trends and what people are more concerned about going into this next election cycle, I feel like would be a story that would be of interest to me, to tell viewers, because you can get a lot of different interesting characters from across the United States, and you can easily find somebody that's from, California that may have different issues that they're concerned about in comparison to somebody that's, living in Florida or that's living in, Kentucky or Mississippi. So being able to find a lot of those individuals and characters to tell that story, I feel like would be very interesting to, to read or to listen to. Granted, because it's, national public radio. So given to read or listen to, I feel like it would be an interesting story to tell.
All right. Well, that's our time, Jonathan Franklin. Where can we find you? When can we listen to you? How do we get to listen to you?
So I not on like a set schedule per se in terms of, like, oh, you can listen to me, weekdays at 5 p.m. on, like in television. I'm not, it's like I said, it's a 24-hour news cycle. So I could be on the weekend, I could be on during the weekday. I feel like the easiest way to keep up is, on social media. I usually try to post a lot of my work, my colleagues' work I think that's interesting, funny memes, just anything on my Twitter and on Instagram and Facebook, and it's pretty much all the same. At That's Johnny Frank, THATSJONNYFRANK, and so that's all across all platforms.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for joining us for the Capital Press Club Legacy podcast series. And I'd like to give my thanks once again to Jonathan Franklin over at NPR. I want to thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.